why aren't the things that actually should be happening for climate change being reported as much as the impacts?
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Well, I'll be quick about it and then let Carol go on with a longer answer. With respect to climate change, I think we have to really understand it. It is more than just a set of policy failures. It is also a communication failure. The general public does not really understand climate change. There's a lot of disinformation with a lot of resources behind that disinformation that has helped muddy the water. And, we're getting to the point where the newspapers and the media is covering climate change better and more in a more nuanced and sophisticated way. But it's 20 years too late, or 20 years later than it should have been. Mm-hmm. Right? This should have been happening in our rearview mirror.
Mm-hmm. I would just say that there are important things going on all around the world, and I kind of yearn for an aggregator that regularly puts this in front of our faces and sort of accelerates the advances in the innovation. Right. But bigger than that, I would suggest is this need for a whole new context. So Rod talked about how the Earth itself has gone through this massive rupture. He might not have used that word, but a massive discontinuity, societally novel, unknown in the history of human civilization. So we're literally, to abbreviate it, we're already living on a different planet with which we have no familiarity. So we need to put all this in a new context. And then I would say test fly through the context, the wind tunnel of this new context, are inherited concepts of security, of economy, of wealth, of success, of education, of everything, basically, because everything has to be rethought. And if that were understood, then we would see more stories and more connection. If people really grasped how existential this is, it wouldn't just be an add-on in the media coverage. I think the rupture in Earth systems needs to be matched by acknowledging the rupture in our ways of knowing, how we know things about humankind's place in the world. And this needs to be translated in our design of education across all levels.
Rod, you just mentioned earlier that people do not fully understand what is going on. And one part is, I think, it has to do with long-term thinking. So how do you get people to care about and imagine things that feel so abstract?
Well, it's hard, right? I mean, I think one of the things that is helpful, so I teach climate change at the university here in DC. I think one of the things that is important is to try to explain why it is not simply an environmental problem. And so that's where I start typically and talk about climate change. If you think about the very original stress on the planet, it is a temperature change. And so temperature, like sunlight, like gravity, is one of the control variables of the planet. And so by adjusting that control variable, you're doing more than just changing the weather and the climate, in fact. Anything that is temperature dependent, whether it is a physical process or chemical process or biological process, ecological, agricultural, industrial, sociological process, if they are temperature dependent, they may be changed and are likely to be changed by climate change. And so I think getting it out of the world of the of envirospeak is crucial because, for example, I'm from the great state of Kansas in the United States. it would be forgiven for people in Kansas, over the last 20 years to think that climate change would not affect them, because so often climate change is mentioned in terms of sea level rise or the Arctic melting, when in fact, agriculture and crop production, which I do not consider environmental issues, are quite affected by temperature and precipitation. And so the thing is that we have to thread this narrative into people's lives, right? It affects health, it affects agriculture, it affects labor, it affects inequity. Everyone is affected by climate change, not to the same degree, of course, but just talking about it in ways that are meaningful to people, I think, is how you engage them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think also the relationship between disease and pandemics and climate change and environmental breakdown is sort of lost on people. But since we're all experiencing this COVID-19 pandemic together, there has been an opportunity to help people understand that disease outbreaks that can become pandemics stem from ecological breakdown, ecological degradation. And so the ways in which we've been pursuing economic activities all these years is not sustainable. And of course, a lot of people know that, but where's the big thinking going on about new economic approaches? It is going on, but I almost never see it discussed in sort of mainstream newspapers. So I go elsewhere for my reporting. Right. I think the Boston Review is very good on this, but I would expect to see more thinking about how can we coexist harmoniously with non-human species, because it's their security too that we should be thinking about. And I can assure you that's not part of the dominant security thinking paradigm.
And if I might jump on something that Carol is communicating, because it's really important. If we just could imagine as a scenario, let's imagine that the biosphere is in real trouble. Forget whether it is or it isn't, but let's just say it is. How would it manifest itself? How would we know? And it would almost certainly be through pests and disease, right? At least a strong factor. And one of the things that we know from climate change, again, one of these outcomes that a lot of people don't know about, but is highly consequential, is that the inhabitants of the biosphere are going through a massive reorganization. Species are moving towards the poles. We can measure it. We can actually track climate change by that. And they're moving upward in altitude. But they're not all going at the same rate. And there's new forms of what some of us call differential biotic mixing. So new ways of species mixing on the planet, in terrestrial settings and marine settings. And when you have new mixing, it follows that you have new opportunities for zoonotic disease. And these pathogens that inhabit these species that are moving are oftentimes evolutionarily predisposed to hop. And so we are creating a planet where the so-called fast-lived organisms, right, that inhabit the microbiosphere and small animals are going to thrive, and more complex, slow-lived animals and primates like us are at a disadvantage.